It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of House Report 115-3. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of House Report Number 115-3, offered by Mr. Al Green of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 40, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this amendment would exclude from this bill regulations that would promote financial stability and prevent or reduce systemic risk. I have indicated previously that we are concerned about the bill's unintended consequence. I don't think that my colleagues are doing this with malice aforethought, but the unintended consequence of stagnating the SEC to the point that it cannot produce regulations that will prevent fraud. Nowhere in the bill does it exempt regulations that will prevent fraud. I believe that this will help us because the bill needs to allow the SEC the ability to move at the speed of innovation. These products are coming on the market. The best way for the SEC to be able to react to them efficaciously would be for the SEC to have rule-making authority at the same speed of the innovation. So I hope that we won't allow the SEC to be bogged down with a cost-benefit analysis that is impossible to produce, and that when produced will produce litigation. Again, I think this is a reasoned, thoughtful amendment, and I trust that it will be adopted. I will reserve.
The gentleman reserves. For what purposes does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just find it a bit ironic, Mr. Chairman, that the other side is not interested in doing this cost-benefit analysis, which is in the underlying bill here, because it's too burdensome. But what do they want to do? They want to add more paperwork and more burden in their amendments. So despite what you've heard, the SEC is not a systemic risk regulator, and even former chairman of the Financial Services Committee, Barney Frank, noted at the time when the FSOC was reviewing asset managers for systemic designations, he recognized that these are not entities that pose a systemic risk to the financial system. And while the SEC does not regulate systemic risk, I am afraid that this amendment could be potentially politically misinterpreted and applied to a number of capital market participants and activities, which they frankly have no business in regulating. So it would lead to the same fire, aim, ready kind of situation, rulemaking that we have seen from the current administration that hinders growth and that capital market formation that we had just talked about in the last amendment. So the bill before us will ensure that future SEC rulemakings are prudently proposed and adopted to achieve the maximum set of benefit, and that's what we are really talking about here today. So while I support the underlying bill, I will have to oppose this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would remind my friend across the aisle that the Volcker Rule does deal with systemic risk. I would remind him that the SEC does play a role in regulating systemic risk. Now, having said that, let's just talk again, and I would engage in a colloquy with you and use my time. Explain to me, sir, how you would quantify a regulation designed to prevent fraud, such as the fraud perpetrated by Madoff. How would you quantify it? Dollars and cents, because that's what you're all about, dollars and cents. How do you quantify that?
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
This has nothing to do with Bernie Madoff, since the whistleblower approached the SEC, and the SEC, using its dollars, was not able to stop him.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman. It does have to do, you are trying to divert us from the actual problem. which is regulations that can prevent fraud. How do you propose to quantify in dollars and cents regulations that will prevent fraud when the fraud that can be perpetrated is not knowable? I yield.
Thank you, and appreciate the gentleman yielding. And working together on the Financial Services Committee, we know that there are actuarial tables where we and analyze risk all the time. You are able to analyze fraud. You are able to analyze that risk.
I reclaim my time. There's no way for anyone to have known what Bernie Madoff was going to do. It was not knowable. You are imposing a mission impossible upon the SEC. There's a real question that has to be answered today, Mr. Speaker, or at some point in the future. Does Congress regulate Wall Street, or does Wall Street regulate Congress? Now, this is a serious question, because that's what this kind of regulation gives us the image of being a part of. Wall Street wants this. This benefits Wall Street. It doesn't benefit mom and pops. It doesn't benefit Main Street. It benefits mega corporations. And you can couch the language in any clever way that you want. In the final analysis, this is all about mega corporations being able to do things that would not be in the best interest of investors. Investors who are listening to this, you ought to be concerned. This impacts you. If this legislation passes, your opportunity to participate in Wall Street with regulations that are going to prevent fraud from being perpetrated upon you, similar to what Madoff perpetrated, will not be possible. I reserve.
One reserves.
Mr. Chairman.
Members are reminded to address their comments to the chair. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I inquire as to the remaining balance of the time?
The gentleman from Michigan has 3.5 minutes.
And the
gentleman
opposition?
from Texas has 30 seconds.
Okay. At this point, I'll reserve, and I'm ready to close.
All right. I thank the
gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in closing, let me simply say this. People who are viewing this at home should become very much concerned about the direction that we're headed in. This is a new Congress, and here we are currently trying to emasculate the SEC by putting it in a position such that it cannot produce rules to protect investors, by requiring it to know the unknowable, to know that a rule you're putting in place to prevent fraud has a quantifiable dollar amount that you can produce so that you can measure that against the cost of producing the rule. Mr. Chairman, this rule that amendment that I propose would benefit the SEC and investors. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.